Welcome back to Withdraw Consent. I'm Jack. Today we're joined with Gerron again. How are you doing, Gerron?
Pretty good. How are you?
Pretty good. So we're going to continue the conversation about the Crusades that I did about the 10th Crusade. I'm going to link that below if you haven't caught that episode. But I got a really good new angle on it from an email from a viewer. And
Okay.
then Gerron has a new angle on it. So he's going to pitch that to you. We're going to talk about the email afterwards. So here we go.
All right. And I'd love to comment on that angle too once I hear it. So, yeah, I watched your episode. I liked definitely where you're coming from. And the Crusades were a very it's a difficult topic because it's not strictly good versus bad per se. Like it's very I mean you
Nuanced.
have what was that?
Nuanced.
Nuanced, yeah. So the premise of this episode, my premise, is that the Crusades, number one, were not, just an invasion of the Middle East. There was a real rationale behind them, and it makes sense when you look at it from the big picture. When you see, of especially first, how they were invited in by the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Emperor, and the other point is that the Crusades didn't really end so much as they just gradually spiraled out of control to the point where you ended up with Islam taking over like a quarter of Europe, the entire Balkan region. But then it got continued through World War One, and then now you have Israel. If you look at it, the Crusades are essentially a tapestry of who controls the Holy Land, and Israel's simply the latest evolution of that, as you said. But the Crusades also didn't start in 1095 when Pope Urban made his speech. The Crusades really started, I mean, you could make the argument as early as, we did an episode on Himyar, but the rise of Islam is as soon as the Muslims rose to power and the Rashidun Caliphate, what's the first thing they did? They stormed through North Africa, through the Levant, through the Middle East. They destroyed the Persian Empire, which at the time was a superpower, basically balancing out the Roman Empire. But the gist to the story is these guys were basically unstoppable up until the 7th or 8th century when Charles Martel, and you know about Charles Martel, right?
Right.
Yeah, when he stopped them at the Battle of Tours. But up until that point, they invaded all of what's now Spain and about half of what's now France. And then for the next 700 years, up until the late 1400s, Spain was engaged in the Reconquista, the Reconquest. So the Crusades didn't even happen until about 300-400 years later. And if you're living in the Middle Ages, you don't have all this technology. Obviously, you don't really know what's going on in the world outside. I mean, you do, but it's nowhere close to the extent we do today. So when these people riding horses, camels, these Moors, Berbers, they arrive on your doorstep, it could be the apocalypse for all you know. So, do you know? Are you familiar with basically how the first crusade, like who invited them in, or like how the Crusaders were invited basically by the Eastern Roman Emperor to basically help him fight off the Muslims?
I'm not familiar.
All right, so this will go a little bit more into the history. So the Eastern Roman Empire around the turn of the millennium was almost to the point of collapse due to internal corruption, greed, a lot of the same things we see here in America. But uh, a lot of people basically given up the idea. They thought, oh, the Byzantine Empire, it's over. The Turks are coming in from the east. The Fatimids are coming in from the south. These Muslims are unstoppable. What are we going to do? So there's a really pious, honestly, one of my favorite emperors and kings in history, honestly, Alexios Komnenos. And he did a full restoration of the empire. He was a very pious, fairly humble monarch. Spent a lot of his time in prayer. But he basically sent a letter to the Pope Urban, And remember, this is shortly after the Great Schism in 1054. So there was just the massive split between the Eastern Church and the Latin Church. And so they didn't outright hate each other or anything. That didn't come till the Fourth Crusade. But they were still on okay terms. So the Pope agreed to organize a crusade, and that's how the First Crusade started. That, in addition to some ambitious Frankish Vikings turned knights, basically the Normans, and they organized the First Crusade, which was, I mean, I would say, and I'm sure you'd agree, was the only successful crusade out of all of them. The rest were failures.
Right. And there's even the Children's Crusade.
Oh yeah.
Ridiculous. Okay.
Why can't they have more of those?
Yeah.
But
okay, but I don't understand how what you're talking about relates to my theory of the 10th Crusade.
Okay, so we'll get to that. So your video, it's generally against the Crusades overall, right? Or it's just against what it turned into?
Well, kind of, because I mean, are you for the Crusades? Like, do you think that was a...
I'm for the idea and for the First Crusade. Like, I think the First Crusade was definitely justified and makes sense. The Crusades after that, because after that they conquered the Holy Land, established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and then Antioch, these little principalities in what's now Israel. But after that, they just basically fell apart, and they went to crap, and they definitely weren't clean. They were, like you said, very they were really messy. But the point I'm making after that is these crusades were basically one after the other. But what happened after the crusades, after the First Crusade, the Muslims just came back, conquered these principalities over time, and then the Ottoman Empire rolled in, and they just kept moving into Europe, and then the whole thing basically became a never-ending crusade, you could say. And so what we have now is like when Israel was reestablished in the
48, 49?
Yeah, 48. Well, I mean, the Ottomans controlled that territory up until the end of World War One. So really, and I mean, you have the Russians fighting these constant wars with the Ottomans. You have the, like the story of Vlad the Impaler and how he fought against the Ottomans. How Europe basically united, sort of, for a time to fight the Ottomans and hold them to a standstill. I would argue that the Crusades didn't really end, so to speak, but they just weren't like full on, this is a crusade sort of things.
Okay, so like what are examples of it continuing after the 9th Crusade?
Okay, so there's so one really big example is the Battle of Vienna in 1683, which wasn't so much of a crusade as more of a like all the European kings unite and come to the aid of Vienna, which is what ultimately stopped the Ottomans. There were also these different groups, especially in the Balkans, which the Muslims had already taken over, and they were constantly like either waging guerrilla warfare, and they had to use basically subterfuge, and they were always kind of held out for the idea that there'd be another crusade. And then in the 1800s, the Crimean War, the Russians actually, there were plans to fight the Ottomans and potentially reconquer Constantinople in the crusade, but that never ultimately materialized.
Okay, when you asked me about my feelings on the Crusades, in that episode I had made the point that like the Crusades are one of the Crusades and the Inquisition are some of the things that are used to mock Christianity from non-Christians
Mhm.
because of the hypocrisy. Like, would Jesus be crusading? You know.
Right.
And so then I was trying to draw the like grandma in the pew next to you, who's 90 years old, is pro Crusades, which seems ridiculous. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like we don't want to
But
be in Crusades, or are
I
you?
think so. I think the most ridiculous part of that isn't so much that it it's not so much that it's hypocrite that Crusades are hypocritical. I mean, they're not. They're definitely not, I would say, the right way to go about it. And like from the perspective of the Byzantines, they, I mean, they were horrified like at the after the first crusade, like kind of what they turned into. Um, but the yeah, the most yeah, the thing with that is these are people like in church that have never experienced, they can never understand what it truly meant to be in a crusade, and like it's from the comfort of the pews. And like if an actual crusader had met someone like today, they'd, I mean, they'd probably be horrified, like with the complacency and everything, because back then it was life or death. It wasn't the mindset of the crusaders was not we're going to go conquer them because we want the Holy Land, so to speak, or because they want to kill Muslims or just take more land. It was survival. They didn't know, like, if they didn't take care of this now, who knows what could happen in the next couple centuries.
And listening to you talk, really, the Muslims really won. They did good because they came in and got the Ottoman Empire. Turkey is now, there's
That's right.
pre-Yugoslavian, whatever used to be Yugoslavia regions that are, Islam now, right? Oh,
Yeah, and it's interesting too because when I mention like more modern crusades, are you familiar with the Balkan Wars that eventually led to World War One?
a little bit, not too well.
Yeah, basically the Greeks, the Serbs, and Bulgarians, Romanians, all these people. They're the most. If you look them up today, they're the most religiously, like, most amount of people who believe in God, go to church, everything. People in the world, and they were under the Ottoman tyranny or the Turkish yoke, as they call it, for 400 or 500 years each. And then in the 1800s, they all rose up, mostly with Russian assistance. But they all rose up and overthrew the Ottoman tyranny. And then that got complicated. These little countries started fighting each other, and then that ultimately led to World War One. But yeah, you could make the argument for sure that from a military perspective, the Turks won, at least up until the time of modernity.
Yeah, because Christianity didn't expand; it contracted through force.
Yeah, in that area. I mean, you could also, I mean, there's Spain, like, and Portugal. I mean, they colonized the New World, and they in Spain
That's a good
right
point.
after the Reconquista too. But
Yeah, that's a good point because they expanded, just not into Islamic territory.
exactly.
Yeah, very good point.
And that's actually why the main reason why Christopher Columbus went to the New World instead of East, because after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which Christians, especially Orthodox Christians at that time, they didn't just see that as we lost our capital. They saw that as it's the end of the world.
I wonder what
Um,
I wonder what Islam was doing while Spain and Portugal were,
hmm,
discovering this new world and proselytizing it. You know what I mean? Because if they would have gotten
yeah.
into it, it would be a whole different scenario in the Americas.
Well, it's interesting because the Ottomans didn't really need to, because they had the Bosphorus, they had basically the center of the world, so to speak. To the east, there were the Safavid Empire, and they were uh, basically, so they were Shiite Muslims. They're the ones that introduced Shiaism, and they're the reason why Iran's Shiite today. And then you had the Mughal Empire in the south. They were in North India. These three empires were, um, they were the most technologically advanced empires in the 15 to 1600s. And yeah, they basically consolidated control and expanded more on land though than at sea.
Okay, are you ready to hear this different view that I got?
Oh hell yeah.
Okay, so check this out. This is the opposite argument that I was making, and it really makes a lot of sense. Okay, so
Mhm.
back during the Crusades, this man Harry, who sends me information, argued that the invaders were the Muslims, right,
Mhm.
to the Holy Land, and the indigenous people of the Middle East were the Orthodox Christians. And during the Crusades, it was the indigenous people who got support from the West, right?
100%.
In the case of modern day, the invader is the state of Israel with
Mhm.
Zionism, and the West are supporting the invaders. The indigenous people are Palestinian Christians, you know, because the Muslims are just the previous invader. And then he says a
Mhm.
crusade in the modern day would be like getting the Western states to defeat the Zionists and reinstate the Palestinian Christians as the head of Israel, as well as the rest of the Middle East. The Middle East originally belonged to the Middle Eastern Christians before the Muslim conquest and before the Zionist conquest. What do you think about that?
Totally agree, spot on. Yeah, because I mean, you look at in the Bible when Rome conquered. Actually, Rome never conquered the Middle East. They were, I mean, they never conquered what's now Israel. They were invited in by the Jewish nobility at the time. Interesting story in the Book of Maccabees, but eventually we have obviously in the Bible Jesus gets crucified, the Jews get scattered, and from that point up until what is it, the early 1600s, when, or 600s rather, when Muhammad and the original caliphate move in, it's Christian. It's in Egypt and North Africa. Most Arabs at that time, at least in the north, are Christians too. If Islam didn't expand, didn't or got quenched quickly, uh, I mean that whole region would be Christian today. It would be crazy. Um, but yeah, I also like how you mentioned how he mentioned that the Israelis are invaders, because I mean a lot of them, they're not even most of them probably they're not even historically ethnic to that region. And historically too, in the Ottoman Empire, Jews were actually treated almost as well as Muslims, whereas Christians were, some might say, second class citizens, but it was probably the worst place to be a Christian before the time of the Soviet Union.
When we're talking about this, I do this Charlie Kirk argument that it's because it's so disgusting to me. But he does this
Yeah.
argument where he's like, well, back when the Muslims had the Holy Land, we couldn't do archaeology there. So, from a Christian perspective, we want Jews to control it because they'll allow Christians to do the archaeology there. That's his argument, right? So, the real reason the
Mhm.
Muslims wouldn't let the Christians do the archaeology there was because they were furious that we were importing a bunch of foreigners from Europe to end up colonizing the land. But now that we're talking about this, if you really did do a 10th Crusade and went and, you know what I mean, basically put a
Mhm.
Christian nation in there and then did freedom of religion and let the Jews do their thing, let the Muslims do their thing. I mean, honestly, it's a decent scenario because who would treat people the best? The Christians.
Yeah,
And then the Muslims second best,
for
and then the
sure.
Jews the worst. I'd imagine, right?
Yeah, the thing, it's tricky though, because I mean, neither the Jews nor the Muslims would ever even let that happen. It would be, plus, I mean, you obviously, it couldn't be modern American evangelical Christianity going in there, because it's totally foreign to, I mean, the Christians living there versus the evangelicals. It's
Hmm.
like it's so foreign.
Because
Also,
it's mostly Orthodox there, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I would say definitely Orthodox, because well, I mean, it's the church, before it split Catholic versus Orthodox, they were all one church. I mean, there were heresies here and there, but the Catholics adopted the extra, like the filioque and papism, but those were never church doctrines until basically up until that point. Um, Plus, the that area's always been Orthodox. Other than, I mean, there's Catholics there too, and the Crusaders obviously were Catholics. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of historical precedent for it, like you mentioned.
Yeah, but can we agree that we shouldn't be doing the thing we're doing now?
Oh hell yeah.
This ridiculous venture. It's absurd.
Hmm. You know what I think is crazy is, Pete Hegseth has that Kingdom of Heaven or Kingdom of Jerusalem tattoo.
Oh, I did not know that. I've seen some of them. The infidel or whatever he's
Yeah.
got. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about it, and everyone's freaking, or people on the left especially are freaking out. Oh, he's a fascist and everything. It's like, no. What I find crazy is that he's got that tattoo, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem was the main Crusader state. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the one that King Baldwin in the movie Kingdom of Heaven is the king of. But no, they were not. A crusader, the last thing they would have wanted to see today is a modern state of Israel.
Yeah.
Because not only is it openly heretical, but like I mean, at the time the Muslims and the Jews were working hand in hand, generally speaking.
Yeah, I can't believe I left out of my Crusader video that the head of the Department of Defense has that tattoo. Because I knew it was Crusader related. I just didn't know specifically what it was. I'd have looked it up,
So, yeah, I mean, looking back on it, and just to kind of summarize, I don't think the Crusades were, I mean, they obviously were a failure, generally speaking. But when you look at what happened with the early Islamic expansion, Toledo in 711, the Reconquista in Spain, what eventually became the Ottoman push into Europe, what they did to the entire Balkan region. Christians were living in essentially slavery for 500-600 years. The Ottoman Empire would kidnap young Christian boys and enslave them. Based on like the hindsight of what actually happened, if the Crusaders were definitely thinking along the right lines, because look what happened to Europe. However, yeah, it obviously is definitely a nuanced topic, and it's also theologically fascinating because I mean, for like people say, like Christ said to turn the other cheek, but he didn't say anything about like just letting the enemies of Christianity come in and walk over everyone. Like, what do you do if an innocent person's being threatened? Or right, like, and that's kind of what was happening with Europe, because the whole point of the Crusades originally was to protect pilgrims who were either unarmed or very lightly armed, and they were just trying to make the pilgrimages so they could see these holy sites in Israel. The same thing that modern American and Western Christian evangelicals do to Israel, except they, I would say, have the wrong focus in mind. Like, it's misguided. So, and I agree for sure with you and the person who you mentioned, Harry, that it's what was it again? Remind me, because I remember generally.
It was that the Muslims were the invaders and the indigenous Christians were displaced. So then the Christians came to help the indigenous people against the Muslims. And so today the Israelis are the foreigners who are invading.
Exactly.
The Orthodox Christians are still the indigenous people. And if we wanted to actually do a crusade, the West would do a crusade to uproot Israel and the Zionists to give the land back to the indigenous people or the Christians, But there's dwindled so many, there's very few remaining. But so many have emigrated that they could, of course, return to the region,
For sure.
And they would if it was free and, happy place.
And it'd be interesting to see something like that, because Israel has that. You're familiar with the law of return?
Yeah. For them
basically,
only.
if you're a Jew, or if you claim to be a Jew, you can go get citizenship in Israel. Imagine if like Orthodox Christians did that. Like because historically, when the Roman Empire, after it was Christianized, obviously controlled the Levant region and what's now Israel. they, yeah, the Christians were living there for thousands of years, and you know what? They never moved out. I mean, a lot of them were forced out. It was brutal, but there's so many. Most of the Christians living there, their families have been there for basically since early Christianity. So, like the Crusades, yeah, they weren't like they were coming in trying to conquer this land that was Muslim. They were plenty of Christians living there, and they were at least in theory trying to protect them. So yeah, it's a really good point. Well, speaking of Pete Hegseth and his Kingdom of Jerusalem tattoo, which looks really good, by the way. No. I've got an interesting theory for you on tomorrow's episode that might explain some of the, all of the extremely pro-Israel policies of Hegseth and Trump. That would actually make sense.
Okay. Sounds great. Looking forward to seeing it. We'll see you all tomorrow.
All right. See ya.